There's a thing they never teach you in intelligence school. Not the compact's version, not ours. Nobody teaches it anywhere because the people who understand it don't write it down. They just carry it with them like an old scar, something that healed crooked and never stopped reminding them it was there. The thing is this: the most dangerous secret is the one your enemy doesn't know they're looking for. That's not a riddle. I'm not being clever. I'm telling you exactly how the Keth Dominion lost a war they were absolutely certain they had already won. And I was standing close enough to the edge of it that I could smell the ozone when the whole thing came apart. Let me start from the beginning, not from the dramatic moment, those come later. Let me start from the part nobody ever tells, which is the long, quiet, utterly boring part where the trap gets built while everyone's watching the wrong hand. I joined the Observer Corps in 2289, which was 9 years after first contact and 6 years after humanity formally joined the Galactic Compact as what the diplomatic paperwork delicately called a provisional sovereign member. Which, if you've ever read a lease agreement written by someone who doesn't really want to rent to you, you'll recognize immediately. It meant, you're in, but we're watching you, and we reserve the right to change our minds. The compact had been around for about 300 years by then. 11 species, later 12 when the Velhari came in from the outer rim. They had protocols for everything. Dispute resolution, resource sharing, territorial boundary management, cultural exchange programs. Very orderly, very thorough. They were particularly thorough about one thing: military inventories. Every member species was required, under the Compact Charter of Mutual Transparency, a document longer than most novels, to submit complete, verified records of their military assets to the Observer Corps on a rotating basis. Ships, ground forces, weapons platforms, orbital installations, everything. The inspections were rigorous. The Keth were particularly enthusiastic about running them, because the Keth had decided, roughly 2 years after humanity joined, that we were going to be a problem. They weren't wrong exactly. They were just wrong about the nature of the problem. The Keth Dominion were impressive physically. 7 feet tall on average, bilateral symmetry, 4 arms, 2 primary and 2 secondary. The secondary ones worked almost like a second set of hands, fine motor capable, good for detailed work. Their skin was a deep mineral gray-green, almost like jade, and they had these eyes that went entirely black when they were under stress, which made it very hard to read them in a negotiation. They were about 400 years ahead of us technologically, or they had been at first contact. They'd been slowing down. We hadn't. That bothered them. By the time I was posted to the Observer Corps Central Station at Verath IV, a compact administrative hub about 40 light-years from Sol, the Keth had been running quarterly inspections of human military assets for 3 years. They did it under the charter, which gave them the right, and they did it very carefully. Their inspection teams were meticulous. They counted everything. Every Terran Alliance warship registered with the compact was documented, photographed, scanned, cataloged. Hull registry codes, crew manifests, weapons loadouts, drive signatures. They were good at it. They were so good at it that by 2291, the Keth Grand Intelligence Directorate, I later learned this from captured records, had produced a document called the Human Military Capability Assessment, Comprehensive Edition. It was 600 pages long. It was, by all accounts, almost entirely accurate. Almost. The first time I met Commander Sen Varkalon, I thought she was maintenance staff. That wasn't me being dismissive. She was dressed in the gray utility coverall that the station's technical crews wore, and she was lying on her back under a relay panel in Corridor 7, which wasn't anywhere near the intelligence wing, with a set of calibration tools spread out beside her. I nearly stepped on a voltage probe. "Watch your feet," she said without looking up. "Sorry," I stepped around the tools. "You need a hand with anything." "Already got 4, she said, and I could hear the smile in it even if I couldn't see her face. "What are you doing in Corridor 7? Intelligence wings on the other side of the station." I stopped. "How do you know I'm from intelligence?" She rolled out from under the panel. Dark eyes, mid-40s, close-cropped hair that had gone silver at the temples, and the kind of face that looked like it had heard every excuse and filed them all away for later reference. She looked at my collar insignia the way a person looks at something they already knew was going to be there. "Because you walk like someone who thinks they're not being watched," she said. "Intelligence people always do. Everyone else walks like they might be." She got to her feet, dusted off her knees. Sen Varkalan, military attaché to the Observer Corps Special Assignment. I took her hand. Yusuf Aldenmore, junior liaison, just arrived. I know, she said. I requested you. That threw me. Requested me, we've never met. No, she agreed, but I read your thesis from the academy, the one about asymmetric information environments and the sociology of military transparency. She started picking up her tools, unhurried. You made an argument that the compact's inspection protocols were designed by species who think linearly about military power. That linear thinking creates systematic blind spots. I had written that thesis. I'd also been told by my advisor that it was interesting but insufficiently diplomatic, and that I should not lead with it in any formal presentations. You read that, I said. Twice, she tucked the voltage probe under her arm. Come on, I'll buy you coffee. We have things to discuss that you shouldn't discuss in a hallway. I followed her, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. That was the day I started to understand what was really happening. Not everything. The full picture took another 3 years. But that conversation in her small office, with 2 cups of actual brewed earth coffee, which she kept as what she called a morale investment, was where the curtain moved enough for me to see the edge of something much larger. Let me ask you something, she said, after we'd been talking for maybe 20 minutes about the inspection protocols and the Keth's documentation practices. When the Keth count our warships, what are they counting? Registered hulls, I said. Compact Charter Article 14 requires full disclosure of. What are they counting? She repeated, cutting me off gently. Not what the Charter requires, what physically exists in their database at the end of an inspection. I thought about it. Ships that are registered with the Compact Military Registry, hull codes, crew, weapons, drive classification. Right, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. And what defines a warship for the purposes of the registry? That took me a moment. Primary purpose of combat or combat support. Weapon systems rated above Compact Category 3. Hull classifications that fall under. Primary purpose, she said. Yes. Okay, she looked at me. What's the primary purpose of a hospital ship? Medical support. Search and rescue vessel. Emergency response. Survey ship. Mapping and scientific assessment. Logistics tender. Supply and maintenance. She set her cup down very carefully. None of those are warships. No, I said. She nodded slowly, like a teacher who has just watched a student arrive at the right answer and is giving them a moment to appreciate it. I sat there for about 4 seconds, and then something opened up in the back of my mind like a window in a room that had been sealed for years. Oh, I said. There it is, she said. The thing about the Galactic Compact's military registry is that it was designed by people who thought about war the way most species think about it. As a specialized activity conducted by specialized vessels with specialized purposes. A warship goes to war. A medical ship heals people. A survey vessel maps territory. These were different things, and they lived in different categories, and the categories were mutually exclusive. That was the assumption. It wasn't wrong exactly. For the Keth, it was completely accurate. Their hospital ships were hospital ships. Their survey vessels did surveys. Their logistics tenders moved supplies. There was no overlap by design, by doctrine, by 3 centuries of established military thinking. Humanity, on the other hand, had arrived at a very different place through a very different path. We hadn't come to space as a unified civilization. We'd come out of centuries of smaller conflicts, resource pressures, shifting alliances, technological improvisation. We'd had to make things work with what we had. We'd learned to build redundancy into everything because the assumption that any single system would function as designed in a crisis was an assumption that had gotten people killed too many times. We'd learned to make things dual purpose, triple purpose, because you couldn't always afford specialized equipment, and because sometimes the specialist wasn't there when you needed them. We'd learned something that the Keth had never needed to learn, because they'd had 400 years of comfortable military dominance and had never had to improvise. How to make a ship that does one thing and can do another. Not illegally, not in violation of the Charter. Every human vessel registered with the Compact carried the weapons and capabilities declared in its registry entry. A hospital ship carried medical facilities. A logistics tender carried repair drones and supply bays. A survey vessel carried sensor arrays and mapping equipment. They also carried other things that were completely compliant with compact regulations, things that the charter didn't prohibit because the charter had never imagined them being necessary. The inspection teams counted our warships very carefully. They never looked at the hospital ships. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make this sound like a trick. It wasn't a trick. It was an engineering philosophy and a doctrine decision that humanity had developed over 60 years of building spacecraft for a complicated solar system, long before the compact existed, long before anyone was inspecting anything. Earth's first hospital ships weren't built for war. They were built because the Martian colonies in the 2170s were remote, and accidents happened, and you needed to be able to get medical care to people who were 3 months from the nearest hospital. So you built a ship that was primarily medical, intensive care bays, surgical theaters, pharmaceutical fabrication, life support redundancy that could handle 200 patients simultaneously. But you also built it to operate in environments that weren't friendly. The asteroid belt isn't friendly. The Jovian radiation environment isn't friendly. Deep space, generally speaking, is not friendly. So you built in hull reinforcement beyond what a combat vessel would need, because a hospital ship couldn't afford to lose pressure. You built in drive systems with power reserves that looked, on a scan, a lot like military-grade propulsion, because a hospital ship running an emergency evacuation needed to move fast. You built in communication arrays that could cut through heavy interference and reach anything in the solar system, because a ship full of patients couldn't afford to go dark. None of that was military, all of it was practical. Then 30 years later, when humanity joined the compact and the charter required you to declare your military assets, you declared your warships. Because your hospital ships weren't warships. They were hospital ships. They just happened to have been built by people who understood that in space. The line between we need to go very fast to save lives and we need to go very fast to fight someone is thinner than the engineers who'd never been in an emergency wanted to believe. Sen Varkalan had been overseeing the careful, quiet, entirely legal expansion of that philosophy for 11 years. She hadn't been hiding anything. She'd been building something, and the Keth, counting their warships every quarter, had never noticed. My first assignment under Sen was mostly administrative. I was processing inspection reports, cross-referencing declarations, making sure the documentation was accurate and complete. It was genuinely not exciting. I want to be honest about that. There's a tendency in retrospective accounts of this period to make it sound like every day was tense and purposeful. Most days were not. Most days were bureaucratic labor, reviewing files, coordinating with the compact's inspection scheduling office, writing correspondence. But every few weeks, I'd come across something in the documentation that made me stop and look twice. A new survey auxiliary vessel being registered. Hull class, exploratory. Primary mission, long-range astronomical mapping. Crew, 48, including 12 science specialists. The registered crew number seemed high for a mapping ship, but scientific missions ran larger crews, nothing unusual. Except I had been doing this long enough by then to notice that the drive classification on that survey ship was, on paper, identical to a drive used in the Keth's own second-line combat escorts. A fast, efficient, highly maneuverable system. Used on a mapping ship because, as the registration documents noted, deep space survey work required rapid positional adjustments to get good astronomical fixes. Completely true. Also, completely true in a completely different context. I flagged it not as a concern, as an observation. I wrote a note in the margin of my copy of the report. Drive class unusual for mission profile, recommend monitoring for fleet-wide pattern. 3 weeks later, Sen came by my office with a cup of coffee. You flagged the perihelions drive class, she said. I thought it was worth noting. She sat down across from me and looked at me for a long moment. In that way she had of evaluating things without showing what the evaluation was producing. How many similar flags have you written in the last 4 months? I'd kept a personal log, 17. And you've been here 4 months? Yes. Have you shared those flags with anyone? No, just internal notes, I paused. Should I have? She was quiet for a moment. Then, no, she said. Yusuf, I'm going to read you into something, but I need to know first whether you understand what I'm about to tell you before I tell it to you. Because sometimes people who understand things understand them incompletely, and that's more dangerous than not understanding them at all. I understand the philosophy, I said. I don't know the details. What do you think the philosophy is? I looked at my coffee. We're building ships that comply with the charter as written, but whose capabilities exceed what their registry classification suggests. Not through deception, through engineering. Through designing medical and survey and logistics vessels to the same standards we apply to warships, because in deep space, those standards aren't optional for any vessel that might find itself in a difficult situation. That's half of it, she said. What's the other half? She looked at me steadily. We're also training the crews. I didn't fully understand what that meant until 6 months later, when Sen arranged for me to spend 2 weeks aboard the TSS Meridian Call, registered as a humanitarian response vessel, currently conducting resupply operations along the outer compact boundary. She arranged it as an orientation visit. On paper, I was there to better understand the operational realities of non-military Terran vessels so I could process inspection documentation more accurately. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. The Meridian Call was a long ship, about 400 meters, which was large for its classification. It had a crew of 210, which was large for its classification. The senior officers I met on the first day were warm, professional, quick to laugh. The chief medical officer was a Scotsman named Dr. Callum Parrish, who brewed his own beer in what he called a strictly regulated fermentation experiment, and whose sickbay was the cleanest, most meticulously organized space I had ever seen outside of a surgery theater. On day 3, I was invited to what the crew called the morning brief, held in the main operations center. It was not what I had expected from a humanitarian response vessel. The operations center had a tactical display. It was very good, better than what I'd seen on some actual warships. It showed the local sector in real time, with tracked contacts tagged and labeled, threat assessments annotated in the margins of the display, approach vectors pre-calculated. The communications officer was running 3 encrypted channels simultaneously. The sensor operator was working a suite that, I later understood, was rated for military-grade passive detection, and could identify hull types at ranges that the Keth's frontline naval frigates would have found competitive. Nobody explained this to me, they just worked. I sat in the back and watched. After the brief, the ship's commanding officer, Captain Abina Asant, mid-50s, the steadiest hands I'd ever seen on a person, walked me through what they'd been looking at. A Keth patrol moving through the sector. Timing, pattern, standard route. You track Keth patrols, I said. We track everything in our operating area, she said simply. It would be irresponsible not to. We have 210 people aboard, and we might be the only vessel within 6 hours' travel if something happens. And the tactical display. We operate in contested space sometimes. During the Velhari boundary dispute, we evacuated a research station that was inside an active exclusion zone. You don't do that blind. She looked at me the way Sen sometimes did measuring. Yusuf, what did you think a humanitarian response vessel did? I thought you carried supplies and medical personnel to crisis zones. We do, she smiled. We also carry the people who carry the supplies and medical personnel into places that don't always want them there. That takes a different kind of preparation. She paused. We've never fired a weapon in anger. We're not warships, but we have never, not once, arrived at a situation we weren't ready for. I went back to my cabin that night and sat for a long time with my personal log open and the cursor blinking. Then I wrote, they didn't build an invisible fleet. They built a fleet that knows how to be invisible because it has never needed to pretend to be anything other than what it is. And what it is more than anyone counted. The Keth's decision to move on humanity came in 2294, 18 months after I returned from the Meridian Call. It didn't come out of nowhere. The Keth had been building toward it for years, in their methodical, four-armed, jade-skinned way. They had a grievance, several actually. Human expansion velocity was making them nervous. The Sol compact representation block had been growing, new allies accumulating, the provisional status of our membership gradually eroding as we demonstrated the kind of civilizational reliability the charter required. The Keth had been comfortable being the dominant military power in the compact for 3 centuries. The idea that they might not always be was, for them, not abstractly uncomfortable but specifically, viscerally threatening. They had done their homework. The Human Military Capability Assessment, Comprehensive Edition, updated quarterly, told them exactly what they were dealing with. 112 registered Terran Alliance warships across 5 hull classifications, weapons inventories, drive capabilities, crew totals, everything accurate, everything documented, everything counted and recounted and verified by inspection teams who were very, very good at their jobs. 112 warships against the Keth Dominion's 840 active combat vessels plus reserves. It wasn't quite a 7-to-1 advantage. After adjusting for the improvements in human ship design, our vessels were, hull for hull, somewhat better than Keth equivalents of comparable age. Their analysts estimated the actual combat power ratio at roughly 5-to-1 in their favor, maybe 4.5 if you were being generous. They decided that was enough. The ultimatum arrived on a Tuesday. I know because I remember what I had been doing that morning. Processing a registration update for a new Terran logistics tender, the Caulfield's Promise, which had just completed its shakedown cruise and was being formally entered into the compact registry. I had been looking at the maintenance drone bay specifications, which were unusually extensive, and thinking, not for the first time, that whoever was designing these ships was doing very interesting things with mass-to-volume ratios in spaces that weren't designated as primary systems. Sen came to my office at 11:47 station time. She closed the door. She didn't sit down. The Keth have delivered a formal notice of military intent to the Compact Arbiter's office, she said. They're demanding that humanity's provisional membership be converted to a protected territory designation, which removes our independent military authority and places our defense assets under Keth administrative control. They've given us 48 hours to respond before they begin enforcement operations. I put down the Caulfield's Promise specifications. What does enforcement operations mean? I said, though I knew. It means they're going to come take our warships, she said. They want to neutralize what they've identified as the source of the threat, the military registry, 112 vessels. I looked at her. What are we going to do? She finally sat down. She was quiet for a moment in the way that Sen was sometimes quiet, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was choosing the exact right words for it. We're going to let them try, she said. The 48 hours that followed the ultimatum were the strangest of my life. Strange not because of chaos or panic. There was very little of either, at least in the spaces I inhabited. Strange because of the quiet, the very deliberate, very human quiet of people who have been waiting for something, and it has finally arrived, and now the waiting is over and what's left is just the work. The Compact Arbiter's office acknowledged the Keth notice and formally notified all member species. By the end of the first day, there were 7 emergency sessions being held simultaneously across 3 stations and 4 remote relay links. The Velhari sent a politely worded communique noting that they found the Keth's approach procedurally irregular. The Marin Collective, 3 small oxygen-breathing species who had historically stayed close to Keth orbit diplomatically, went very quiet, which in my experience was almost always more meaningful than loud declarations. Humanity's official response to the Keth was delivered at 23:15 station time, roughly 12 hours into the ultimatum window. I read it. It was 12 sentences long. The key line was near the end. The Terran Alliance respectfully declines to surrender administrative authority over its registered military assets and notes that any attempt to enforce the requested transfer by kinetic or non-kinetic means will be considered an act of war under Article 77 of the Compact Charter, with all rights and obligations thereof. 12 sentences. After 2 years of intelligence work, I had learned to read Terran official statements the way you read a map in bad light, paying attention not just to what was there, but to what the terrain implied was around the next corner. That last clause, with all rights and obligations thereof, was doing a lot of work. Article 77 didn't just define acts of war. It defined the response options available to a member species that had been attacked, including options that did not require compact approval, including options that could be implemented immediately without a vote, without a committee session, without diplomatic clearance. Article 77 said, in language 300 years old, if someone comes for you, you can fight back, and you don't have to ask permission. The Keth had read Article 77. They'd calculated that their 5-to-1 military advantage was sufficient to make that clause irrelevant. 112 warships against 840 was not a fight humanity could win, regardless of what the Charter permitted. They were still counting 112 warships. What I'm going to describe now, I'm going to describe as accurately as I can, drawing on my own observations and on the records I've been permitted to access since the Accord. There are things I still don't know. There are details I wasn't cleared for then and haven't been cleared for since. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I was there for enough of it, at the edge of it, at the hinge of it, that I can tell you what it looked and sounded and felt like. The Keth fleet began its advance at hour 31 of the 48-hour window. They weren't waiting for the deadline. They'd decided internally that the human response made it clear no agreement was coming, and that moving early, before humanity could make what their analysts called repositioning maneuvers, was tactically advantageous. 840 ships. It was the largest fleet mobilization in compact history. They came out of their assembly point at Keth Station Gorathon in 3 waves: Vanguard, Main Body, Reserve. The Vanguard alone was larger than humanity's entire declared military fleet. I was at the observation center on Verath IV watching the tactical feed when they came through the transit corridor. The display updated every 40 seconds. Contacts appearing, tagged, sorted. It was deeply, deeply impressive. The kind of impressive that has weight that sits on the chest. Sen was standing next to me. She had her coffee. She'd been awake for 30 hours by then, and she showed almost none of it, which had stopped surprising me about 8 months in. First contact estimate? She asked the sensor officer without looking up from her cup. 42 hours at their current advance rate, the officer said. They'll reach the human core systems in approximately. They won't reach the core systems, Sen said. There was a small silence. Not uncomfortable. Everyone in that room had been briefed. It was more the silence of people who understood what was coming and were experiencing that particular human feeling of waiting for a very large thing to begin. When, I asked her quietly. She looked at the display. About 37 hours. What happens at 37 hours? She glanced at me sideways. The census breaks. I need to explain something about how the Compact's tracking systems worked, because it's important for understanding what happened. The Compact maintained a real-time military tracking database, the Combined Sensor Network, or CSN, which aggregated sensor data from installations throughout Compact space and kept a running count of all declared military vessels. When the Keth fleet mobilized, they were tracked on the CSN. When humanity's warships moved to defensive positions, they were tracked on the CSN. The CSN showed at any given moment what every declared military asset was doing and where. The Keth fleet commanders were watching the CSN, watching humanity's 112 warships repositioning, forming defensive clusters, falling back toward core systems in the face of an overwhelming advance. The math was simple. Even if those ships fought brilliantly, even if each of them somehow took down 5 Keth vessels before being destroyed, the Keth would still have 380 vessels remaining at the end of it. More than enough. What the CSN did not track was everything else. Because everything else wasn't on the registry. At hour 34 of the Keth advance, a Keth Vanguard squadron, 60 vessels, mostly destroyer class, fast ships meant to screen the main force, passed through a transit corridor near the Compact waypoint station at Lenthari Junction. It was a routine movement. They had done it before in exercises. The junction was essentially an empty point in space, a navigation landmark, no military significance, no strategic value. Except that the humanitarian response vessel Meridian Call was currently docked at Lenthari Junction, having completed a resupply run for the Compact's border assistance program 3 days earlier. And the survey ship Long Silence, registered for deep space astronomical mapping, had been conducting a routine survey pass through the junction's outer sensor grid for the past 11 days. And the logistics tender Caulfield's Promise, fresh off its shakedown cruise and officially ferrying maintenance supplies to a station 4 hours further into Compact space, had stopped at Lenthari for what the crew log recorded as unscheduled maintenance pause, primary drive recalibration. 3 vessels, none of them warships, all of them technically just there. The Keth Vanguard Squadron came through the transit corridor, and they saw those 3 vessels, and their threat assessment protocols flagged them as non-military, confirmed registry match, no discrepancy, and moved on. They passed through the junction in about 6 minutes. In that 6 minutes, the Meridian call, the long silence, and the Caulfield's promise had profiled every single one of those 60 vessels. Drive signatures, energy output, weapons charge status, hull integrity data, communication frequencies. The sensor suites on those 3 ships, survey grade, emergency response grade, maintenance grade, were exceptional. The data went out on a tight beam encrypted relay compressed into a 2-second burst and was received by 37 separate addresses simultaneously. 37 addresses, each of them a human vessel, none of them registered as warships. I'm going to describe something here that I want to be careful about, because I've heard it described badly by other people who were watching from a distance, and the bad description makes it sound smaller than it was. At hour 37 of the Keth Advance, 904 Terran Alliance vessels began active tracking operations against the Keth fleet. 904. The Keth had counted 112. The ones they hadn't counted were, technically, exactly what their registry entry said they were. Hospital ships with military-grade sensor arrays and combat-hardened hull plating and drive systems rated for emergency insertion. Survey ships with precision long-range weapons platforms disguised as telescope mounts. Logistics tenders carrying maintenance drones that were, in a completely separate but entirely accurate sense of the phrase, extremely good at removing things from other things. Search and rescue vessels with enough fuel reserves to pursue a target across 3 transit corridors. Science ships with reactors powerful enough to run a weapons grid. None of them had ever been inspected as warships because none of them were warships. They were exactly what their papers said. They were also, in this moment, something else. Let me tell you about Ensign, later Lieutenant, later Commander, Priya Sethuraman, because I met her and she was real and what she did was real, and I don't want this to become abstract at the point where it should be the most human. Priya was 26 years old in 2294. She had been serving as a navigation officer on the survey ship Vast and Patient for 3 years, having previously graduated from the Bangalore Space Academy in the top 5% of her class. The Vast and Patient was registered for deep space stellar mapping. It had a crew of 41, a beautiful long-range sensor array, and a drive system that its chief engineer, a cheerfully profane woman from Newfoundland named Yolland who'd been building ship drives for 30 years, described as technically rated for mapping, but let's say she's got opinions. When I talked to Priya, about 8 months after the accord, she described that morning this way. We'd been in holding position for 6 days. Just sitting there, running surveys like we were supposed to, which we were, that part was real. We actually did have astronomical data to collect. But we knew. Everyone knew. We'd been briefed before departure and we'd all signed the acknowledgement forms and then we'd just gone out and done our jobs because that was the job. She paused, and when she continued, there was something in her voice that wasn't quite awe but was related to it. When the activation signal came through, Yolland was in the engine room and I was at navigation, and the captain, Captain Ferrero, she's been flying for 30 years. She didn't say anything dramatic. She just looked at us and said, "Okay, people, let's go to work." And it was exactly the same voice she used when she said, "Okay, people, let's go map a star system." The exact same tone. And something about that, just the ordinary voice for an extraordinary thing, it made it feel manageable, like we could do it. Like of course we could do it because this was what we'd trained for. The Vast and Patient took position at the left flank of the Keth main body at hour 39, along with 216 other vessels. None of them warships. The Keth fleet commanders noticed something was wrong at hour 40. Not because of what they could see was still approximately correct. Humanity's declared warships were where they'd been, doing what they'd been doing. The CSN showed nothing unexpected. What they noticed was the signal's environment. The problem with 900 non-military vessels deciding to operate in a coordinated military manner is that the electromagnetic signature of that coordination is very hard to mistake for coincidence, once you know to look for it. The Keth Fleet's Signals Intelligence section picked up, within a relatively short window, an unusual density of encrypted traffic in their surrounding space. Too much traffic, traffic that didn't match the movement of declared vessels. Traffic that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, from points on the sensor grid that showed nothing but empty space, and occasionally, a survey ship or a hospital tender or a science vessel that had no reason to be generating that kind of encrypted burst. The Keth Signals chief filed a report at hour 41. It was rated Priority 2, which was high but not the highest. The fleet commander reviewed it and noted that there appeared to be some kind of anomalous signals environment, possibly interference from the local stellar medium, possibly. And this was the note that would later become somewhat famous in post-conflict analysis. Unauthorized civilian communications, recommend advisory to compact civilian authorities. Unauthorized civilian communications. He thought it was ships calling home. The first engagement happened at hour 42 and 17 minutes. I want to describe this accurately. There's been a lot of dramatized reconstruction, and most of it gets the emotional texture wrong by making it too loud, too sudden, too spectacular. The reality was quieter in some ways, slower, and then very briefly incredibly fast. The Keth Vanguard's 60 destroyers, having passed through Lenthari Junction and continued their advance, found themselves, at hour 42, with an unusual number of contacts at their perimeter. Ships they had scanned and cleared, non-military, confirmed, that had nevertheless moved into positions that a tactician would describe as coordinated flanking geometry. The Vanguard Commodore ordered a halt and a rescan. His sensor teams ran the contacts again. The registry matches came back clean. Hospital ship Meridian call, survey ship long silence. Logistics tender Caulfield's promise. 6 other vessels that had transited through the junction over the previous 72 hours, registered, verified, non-military. He sent a communication to the Meridian call because it was the largest, demanding an explanation for its positioning. Captain Asant's response came back within 90 seconds. She said that the Meridian call was a humanitarian response vessel operating in open space, that its positioning was in compliance with all compact regulations governing non-military vessels in a potential conflict zone, which, she noted, the regulations required non-military vessels to maintain a safe distance from military operations, and the Meridian call was currently at that safe distance, and that the Keth fleet's advance through this sector had been noted and documented per standard protocol. Documented. She was documenting them. 9 ships, scanning everything, recording everything, and the lead ship's captain was calling it documentation. The Vanguard Commodore, I later read, marked her response in his log as unusual and moved on, because he had an advance to prosecute and 60 destroyers and 112 human warships to get to. He made it another 40 minutes. At hour 43 and 2 minutes, the Keth Vanguard's lead destroyer, the Gorathan's Blade, a beautiful ship by all accounts, new construction, fast, suffered a catastrophic failure of its primary drive manifold. The cause was initially listed as mechanical failure. The drive manifold had been struck by a piece of debris, an extremely dense piece of debris, traveling at an extremely precise vector, which had been launched from a maintenance drone currently designated as part of the operational inventory of the logistics tender Caulfield's Promise. The maintenance drone was 40 meters long, mass rated at 12 tons, and had been designed for hull interface operations, which, in the context of the Caulfield's Promise's registry documentation, meant repairing the exterior hulls of damaged vessels. The drone was very precise. It was very good at identifying structural weak points in hull sections and applying focused mechanical force. It turned out that this capability was not exclusively useful for repair. The Gorathan's Blade lost propulsion. It did not explode. The drone's impact was precisely calibrated. The ship was disabled, not destroyed. That was deliberate. Sen had explained the doctrine to me months earlier in one of our coffee conversations when I'd asked how this was supposed to work in practice. "We're not trying to destroy their fleet," she'd said. "If we destroy their fleet, we've created 800 dead ships full of Keth crew, and the Compact spends the next 50 years managing the political fallout, and the Keth spend the next 100 years planning revenge. We want them to stop. We want them to look around and count the things they never counted before and realize they made a very serious error in their arithmetic." She'd paused. "A disabled ship communicates that better than a destroyed one." The Gorathan's blade went dead in space. Its crew sent distress signals immediately. The Vanguard formation, 60 destroyers, began emergency protocols. And then 2 more destroyers experienced drive failures, from different vectors, same precise methodology. And then a 4th, and the signals environment, which the Keth signals section had already flagged as anomalous, became extremely loud. What the Keth Vanguard Commodore saw on his tactical display at that moment was, by all accounts, remarkable. I've read the reconstruction several times. His tactical display showed 60 destroyers, and around them, the 9 non-military vessels that had been logged and cleared. Everything else on his display was empty space. And then, between one update cycle and the next, 40 seconds, just 40 seconds, the display was not empty. It is important to understand that those 904 vessels had not been using stealth technology. There was no cloaking device, no sensor-defeating system, nothing that violated charter regulations or pushed against the boundaries of legality. They had simply been registered as what they were, doing what they did, and the Keth's military tracking systems, designed to track military assets, had been tracking military assets and had therefore tracked them as exactly what they appeared to be: non-threats, non-combatants, background traffic. When those 904 vessels lit their drives in coordinated formation and painted the Keth fleet with active targeting sensors, the tactical display didn't show 904 new contacts appearing. It showed 904 contacts that had been there the entire time, finally being recognized for what they were. The Keth Vanguard Commodore's log entry at that moment, recovered after the accord, read: "Where did they come from? Where did they come from? Signals contact across full sphere. Contact count, 20-second gap in the log. This is not correct. This data is not correct. Request verification from." The verification never came. His signals section was too busy. I was watching the tactical feed on Vereth IV when the contact count updated. I've tried a few times to describe what that was like, and I haven't found the right words yet. Maybe there aren't right words for it, which is an unsatisfying thing to admit but is probably true. I'd known, in an abstract way, what was coming. Sen had read me into enough of it that I had a general picture. But there's a difference between understanding something and seeing it. The Keth fleet had been 840 contacts on the display. Clean, organized, wave-formatted, terrifying. And then the human side of the display, which had been 112 contacts, spread thin, falling back, looking exactly like an overwhelmed defense, started changing. First 50 new contacts, then another 100, then 200 more. The display was updating faster than I could track individual ships. Survey vessels and hospital ships and logistics tenders and search and rescue craft and science ships and supply runners, all of them suddenly visible, suddenly active, suddenly resolved from background noise into the hard tactical reality of a fleet. Sen was standing next to me. She had her coffee. 904, I said. 916 now, she said, without looking up from her cup. 3 more came out of their survey holds in the last cycle. I looked at the display. We outnumber them. We outnumbered them before they started, she said. They just counted the wrong things. The Keth fleet did not disintegrate or panic. I want to be clear about that because the worst versions of this story make them sound incompetent, and they weren't. They were a disciplined, experienced military force with excellent training and deep institutional knowledge. When the contact count on their displays went from 112 to 916 in the space of about 4 minutes, their response was professional. They reformed. They tightened their formation. Their communications discipline stayed intact. But the math had changed. 840 against 916 was a different war than 840 against 112. Particularly when the 916 had just demonstrated, with clinical precision, that they could disable specific systems on specific vessels from positions the Keth fleet hadn't known to defend against. The Caulfield's Promise and 6 other logistics tenders had now disabled 11 Keth vessels, not destroyed, disabled, and had done it from ranges and angles that the Keth Vanguard's defensive doctrine hadn't accounted for, because those ranges and angles were where non-military ships hung out, and you didn't build your defensive doctrine around non-military ships. The Keth fleet commander, Admiral Vresthan, a 30-year veteran of the Dominion's naval service, later captured in oral testimony that he'd been playing war games against human forces for 8 years, made a decision at hour 44. He sent a communication to the compact arbiter's office. He said he wished to request a temporary cessation of hostilities and an urgent clarification of the status and registry classification of certain vessels in the operational theater, which appeared to be, in his words, inconsistent with their declared non-military designation. The compact arbiter's response came back in 17 minutes. I know because I was in the office when it arrived. The arbiter, a 400-year-old Velhari administrator named Sooth of Seven Waters, whose comm had never visibly cracked in the 20 years I later learned they'd been serving, noted that all vessels in the operational theater had been reviewed and confirmed as compliant with the compact military registry, and that the Terran Alliance wished to draw the Admiral's attention to the fact that the charter contained no prohibition on non-military vessels operating in formations. No prohibition on non-military vessels gathering intelligence. No prohibition on non-military vessels utilizing the maintenance and emergency equipment standard to their classifications in whatever manner their captains deemed appropriate for crew safety. The maintenance drones were crew safety equipment. The arbiter also noted, very politely, that Article 77 remained in effect, and that the compact's observation of the advance of the Keth fleet had been thorough and was being documented. Documented? Sooth of Seven Waters had used the same word Captain Assant had used. I thought reading it, they knew, the arbiter knew too. I don't have perfect knowledge of what happened inside the Keth fleet's command structure over the next 9 hours. What I have is the observable record, the communications that were eventually shared during the Accord negotiations, and a conversation I had, 14 months later, with a Keth officer who had served on the fleet's command ship. His name, transliterated, was something like Vrith Gorethas, though he told me I was welcome to call him Gorethas, which was the informal version. He was younger than most of the senior command, maybe 60, which in Keth terms was early middle age. He spoke compact standard with a precision that suggested he'd studied it formally, and he had the Keth habit of going very still when he was thinking rather than showing restless movement. We talked for about 3 hours. Most of it I can't share, it was covered by the Accord's disclosure restrictions. But there was one exchange that I've thought about many times since. I asked him what the Fleet Command's reaction had been to the contact count update. He was quiet for a long time, not processing the translation he was thinking. We had reviewed your military assessment thoroughly, he said. Many times we were confident. The inspection records were careful and complete. He paused. Our initial reaction was that the data was wrong, that our sensors were malfunctioning. We ran diagnostics for, I believe it was 11 minutes. When the diagnostics confirmed the sensors were functioning correctly, there was a secondary reaction. What was that? He tilted his head in the gesture I'd learned meant something like rueful acknowledgement. We asked ourselves, what else did we count wrong? That question, what else did we count wrong? He told me that once that question entered the command space, it did not leave, because the answer was they didn't know. They had been completely certain of their assessment, completely certain of the number, and the number had been completely wrong. Not by a small margin, by a factor of 8. And if they'd miscounted warships by a factor of 8, what had they miscounted about weapons capabilities? About drive performance? About doctrine? About the willingness of those 916 crews to fight in defense of something they believed in? We did not know, he said. And that not the ships themselves, not the tactical situation, that uncertainty is what ended the advance. He said Admiral Vresthon had convened a command meeting at hour 47 and asked a simple question. What do we actually know? The answer honestly assessed was, the number of vessels facing us is larger than expected, their capabilities are unclear, our tactical models do not account for their operational doctrine, and we do not know what else we have miscounted. Vresthon had sat with that for a while. Then he had issued the recall order. The Keth fleet reversed course at hour 48, almost exactly at the deadline they'd set. I don't know if that was intentional timing, whether Vresthon chose the number deliberately so that it would look like a measured decision rather than a tactical retreat. Maybe. He was a sophisticated operator. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that 829 Keth vessels, 11 had been disabled, turned around and went home. No shots fired. No human ships destroyed. No Keth ships destroyed. 11 disabled, all crews intact, the ships themselves salvageable. A fleet that had come to take humanity's military and had instead done an accounting exercise, found the books didn't balance, and gone home to figure out what had gone wrong with their math. On Verath IV, the observation room was quiet when the contact count started falling. I remember people exhaling, not cheering, just breathing, like they'd all forgotten to breathe for a while and were now remembering. The sensor officer put her head down on her console for about 5 seconds. The communications chief took off his headset and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Sen finished her coffee. She looked at the display for a long moment, at the retreating Keth formation, clean and organized still. Dignified in retreat in the way that a force with a lot of institutional pride can manage even when things have gone badly wrong. 919, she said. 3 more came online during the retreat pattern, good positioning. Is it over? I asked. The advance is over, she said. The next part is the diplomacy, which is harder and longer. She set her cup down. But yes, the part where people might have gotten killed is over. She picked up her jacket from the back of her chair. I'm going to get some sleep, she said. Write up your observations tonight while they're fresh, everything, details. The way you've always done. She walked out of the observation room and she looked, going out the door, exactly like she'd looked coming in. Practical, unhurried, carrying her empty coffee cup, like someone who had just finished a long day's work and was going home. Which, I suppose, is what she was. The Accord of Verath IV was signed 11 months later. It was, diplomatically, a complicated document. I read all 600 pages of it and contributed footnotes to 14 sections. It redefined the terms of humanity's compact membership, removing the provisional status and establishing us as a full sovereign member with all the rights and obligations thereof. It established new inspection protocols that, and this was the part I found most quietly satisfying, redefined what constituted a military asset in terms of operational capability rather than primary purpose designation. The Keth accepted those terms. It cost them a great deal of institutional pride, and I think if you asked anyone in the Dominion about it honestly, they would say they still aren't entirely comfortable with how it went. But they accepted the terms. There's a passage in the Accord's preamble, written by Sooth of Seven Waters, that I've committed to memory. It's about 8 sentences long, and it summarizes what the Arbiter called the pedagogical value of the Lenthari incident, which is the official name for the 48 hours I've been describing. The last line of that preamble reads, in compact standard, a complete count of visible things is not knowledge. Knowledge requires also an account of what one did not think to look for. That line was submitted by the Terran Alliance delegation. I've always suspected Sen wrote it. I saw Captain Abina Assant once more, about 2 years after the Accord, at a ceremony in Geneva where several of the crews from the Lenthari response were being recognized. She looked exactly as I remembered, steady, unhurried, the kind of presence that doesn't expand to fill a room so much as it quietly holds the room together. I thanked her for letting me aboard the Meridian Call, back in 2292. She shook her head. That was Sen's idea, she said. She always said the best way to understand something is to stand inside it for a while. She was right, I said. Usually was, she smiled, the kind of smile that carries old respect for someone. She'd teach you anything else worth keeping. I thought about it, about Corridor 7 on Verath IV, and the coffee, and the thesis nobody was supposed to lead with, and the moment in the observation room when the contact count changed and she hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, had just kept drinking her coffee because she'd known, because she'd always known. She taught me the thing about the most dangerous secret, I said. Assant tilted her head. Which thing? The most dangerous secret is the one your enemy doesn't know they're looking for. She considered that for a moment. Then she nodded. Yeah, she said, that's the one. I'm going to end with the thing that still stays with me, 11 years on. 919 ships. Hospital vessels and survey ships and logistics tenders and search and rescue craft and science ships and supply runners. 210 people on the Meridian Call, 41 on the Vast and Patient, 63 on the Caulfield's Promise. Thousands more across all of them. People who'd spent years doing real work, actual survey work, actual medical work, actual supply runs and maintenance operations and emergency responses, while also being, in a quiet and undeclared and entirely legal way, something more. Crews who had trained for a situation they'd hoped would never come, and when it came, had done their jobs. Both jobs at once. Nobody built a fake fleet. Nobody smuggled weapons or falsified documents or lied in an inspection. The ships were exactly what their papers said. The crews did exactly what their mission logs showed. Every piece of data the Keth's inspection teams had ever collected was accurate. It was just that accuracy about what they'd counted told them nothing about what they hadn't thought to count. There is a framed copy of Sooth of Seven Waters' preamble on the wall of my office. I've had it for 9 years. I look at it sometimes when I'm processing inspection reports, which I still do, force of habit mostly, and because I still notice things in the margins that are worth noting. A complete count of visible things is not knowledge. Knowledge requires also an account of what one did not think to look for. The Keth counted every human warship. Right up until the moment 919 ships turned on their targeting sensors, they were completely certain of the number. They were just counting the wrong things.